Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome to Mapping Global China Conversations Professor Prasenjit Duara, a leading historian and thinker whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of East Asia and the global dimension of modernity. Professor Duara is the Oscar Tan Chair of East Asian Studies at Duke University. And his groundbreaking book, Culture, Power, and the State, Rural North China, remains a foundational text in the study of modern Chinese history, and his subsequent works, like Rescuing History from the Nation, Sovereignty and Authenticity, and the Crisis of Global Modernity, continue to inspire scholars across disciplines and geographies, offering powerful critiques of nationalism, modernity, and global historical consciousness. As we reflect today and in the past decades on China's expanding global presence through the Mapping Global China project, Professor Duara insights on transnationalism, sovereignty, and alternative modernities offer an essential lens for thinking beyond the nation states and for imagining the conceptual frameworks we use to understand China's roles in the world today. Professor Duara, thank you for being with us. It's a true honor. I read your book during my PhD and after, so it's really shaped the way I think also about China, sovereignty, nationalism, and thank you. Your intellectual journey has spanned continents and decades, from growing up and studying in India to pursuing a PhD in Chinese history at Harvard and holding leading academic positions across the US and Asia. I want to ask you how your own personal and scholarly trajectory shaped the way you see China, and how have the transformations within China itself of the past decades challenged or reaffirmed your earlier understanding?
Yeah, thank you, Adele. That is a question I frequently get asked, although you have put a different spin on it, which is how does it shape my understanding of China today? Now, the reason I got interested in China because I got interested during the early 1970s in when I was a student in Delhi, and there was a lot of interest in the Cultural Revolution and all the rhetoric of the Cultural Revolution. And there were several people who started out to advocate for India, the Chinese path, and I was also interested in that. But a certain point, it became clear to me that something like the Chinese Revolution could not happen in India. That was, and later, many years later, I think 30 years later, so I wrote in the well known, I had written a piece earlier in that journal called Economic and Political Weekly, but I wrote a piece 30 years later called Maoist Insurgency and the Chinese Revolution in India, where I made an argument as to why it was not possible and why it is that revolutions seem to thrive in places where they don't have tight hierarchical agricultural organizations. And if you look at it, revolutions also took place in very peripheral places in China. And now revolutions are really activities among tribal groups who have, in fact, are not embedded in this complex agrarian hierarchical system of dependence and interdependence. So that was, I think, one of my main findings later. But then as I moved on, my first book actually was interested in the Chinese Revolution. But since then, I became more interested in nationalism and state building in China. And I see, for a while, I began to see Chinese nationalism as sort of overcoming its socialistic and revolutionary and global South kinds of orientation and declarations. Now, I think that it has adjusted, and now we're not very clear whether national interests have fully trumped some of those ideas, but they certainly go a long way. That still doesn't mean that, what the Chinese have to contribute to the world is not great. I mean, so that's my basic understanding. So, very interested, and then sort of a change of view of India, and then to come back to sort of a relatively sort of a view of Chinese as dominated by nationalism, and now a little bit still mixed.
Yeah, and actually, I have a follow-up question that is really more related to Xi Jinping. I know you're a historian, but recently you've been writing also more about recent
Yeah.
trends, Belt and Road. And so you've written about the temporal tensions in early civilizationist narratives, the pull between timeless values and revolutionary change. How do you see these dynamics unfolding in Xi Jinping view and articulation of the new era for China, the China dream?
Yeah, I think that there is a certainly a strong pull and a tension between them, but it is a tension that Chinese seem to have managed quite well in recent years. And the way is that Xi Jinping and his advisors seem to have constructed a discourse, a language which both emphasizes, and Xi Jinping is very nationalist. We know that he has a very strong view of Chinese history as having shaped China's present. And this history is 5,000 years or more of continuous history, right? This history is, for him, has some very important elements that contribute to the present, just the continuity of the state form, the ability to select, although it happened just for some centuries, the ability to for a centralizing state to select administrators who are, which is supposedly meritocratic, although some people deny that, and all of those things. So he certainly does emphasize the importance of Chinese civilization. But when it comes to going out, he emphasizes there is that, but it is sort of subordinated somewhat to the idea of equality and respect with the partner countries of the Belt and Road. So we know that both are happening, but so far they have not allowed the one to trump the other. They keep them in a kind of both in a role that is supplement to the other, right? When they need to, they pull up this thing. So, for instance, there is sometimes they put it. I was at a Sri Lanka, which has, of course, very important BRI dimensions. And I noticed the exhibition there that they were showing how Changha brought East Asian Buddhism to Sri Lanka and how he's a great patron of Buddhism. Now we all know that Changha is a sailor and a military man, right? And that he actually deposed. He fought wars in Sri Lanka and deposed. And then they show a picture of a Sri Lankan princess from the 15th century, a descendant together with the Sri Lankan prime minister. Have you seen that?
No,
It's
no,
a
I
very interesting
haven't.
pictures. And it's all there in the National Museum and so on in Sri Lanka. So, in a way, they do want to connect the greatness of China and its maritime tour trips and so on to the partnerships that they're developing. But one thing I want to say, and this is actually referring to an earlier question that you skipped, but it's also related, which is that I think that one of the issues that we see is that China still claims to be peaceful in many respects, but we have seen that this is when you have so many investments in a country and there are people threatening it, there is a tendency towards militarization among a hegemonic power, right?
Mm, mhm.
So far, China has military operations. It has this, what is it, global defense strategic initiative and so on. but it has avoided major military confrontations with BRI countries. I mean, it has had with India, it has had with Philippines and Taiwan and South China Sea and all of that, but it has been able to avoid it. And we'll have to see how much its own interests impel it in that direction, right? That's a different type of answer, but I wanted to get that in as well.
Thank you. And I think I want to kind of dive a bit deeper into this aspect of China peaceful rise and these narratives that China, that this civilization discourse, civilization
Mhm.
initiative that is tied now with China global expansion, BRI. Also, this idea of community, of shared future or common human destiny. How is it different from like imperialist discourse in the past? And so you said that China now has no interest in being more militarized or to be more threatening.
As
As
yet,
yet, exactly.
yeah,
So my question, like, can we rest assured that this will be its peaceful future, peaceful rise? China can defy pattern that we know from realism, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
rising power with threatened hegemon. It already
yeah,
can. And now we're in a state where, yeah, China, it's rising great power. It has not quite militarized as much as the United States, probably also because it would have triggered a strong reaction, right, from the
yeah,
States. And
exactly.
historically, so it cannot really develop alliances like the United States, but we see also projects along the BRI that have been more securitized and diaspora abroad, China interests abroad that needs to be protected. What do you think is the trajectory? Like, also, what does this mean? Like, can you kind of dissect for us the meaning
Yeah,
of community, of shared future, all this
yeah.
civilization discourse? Why? Because US doesn't do a civilization discourse. Where do we hear about civilization? China. So why do you think, and you as historian that studied civilizations, why do you think so much focus on that?
I think the civilization focus is, of course, a sort of civilization discourses have always been potentially, if not really, means of extending your kinds of values, your kinds of interests, your kind of soft power across as large a space of the world as you can, right? And so it is clear that China's emphasis on global civilization discourse is relatively new, and it follows upon its investments and its BRI development projects and so on. I mean, it has had, civilizational ideas, but more internally, and
Mhm.
it has developed somewhat Silk Road ideas and so on. It began to call. So gradually it went from ecological civilization and this idea of within the domestic society of civilization becoming something that is a true quality, especially true capitalist quality, right? Suzhi,
Mhm.
chicken and mayo suzhi. If you choya and the mayo suzhi. So it went from that to when it went abroad, it didn't go as civilization, even in 2013 of 14, 15. Became Silk Road. And then I think, in 2022 and so on, it became an official category of civilization. Of course, we're talking about the discourse and the official discourse. So that it's a way of sort of alerting partners, collaborative partners to enter into equal terms. If you look at historically, the first generation of imperialists, like the French and the British and so on, they had a very clear sense of the colonized as the other, right? They were not us, they were not equal to us at all. Then you have a situation which I've written about quite extensively, where you have the new imperialists, the competing imperialists, whether it's US, Japan, Russia, and so on, at the turn of the 20th century, who begin to talk about, "Oh, you and I are really connected. We are sort of the same. We will respect your nationality. And this is exactly what Pan Asianism is about, right? We will save you from these imperialists. It's a paternalistic. But even the Russian, the relationship with China, if you think of it, they were supposed to be, before 1960, they were supposed to be equal partners, right, in the socialist bloc. But of course, what the Chinese really resented was this big brother attitude. So, in a sense, you could say that they declared formal equality with informal racism. And certainly that was the case with US, which also created the United Nations, brought everybody, but then also dominated throughout. And racism, both in the Russian and the American case, was terrible, as was also in the Japanese case, the Yamato and so on. They used to call the Chinese, hey, kuli, and things like that. The Chinese are pushing this modality of being equal partners and so on. We are not yet, its attitude towards racism or involvement in corruption, this, that, and the other. Certainly, one thing is clear that it associates with it's not illiberalism allows it to associate with state powers and not with society, although sometimes it does sort of engage with civil society. And after 2018, I think they started more, but after 2018, they also don't have too many of those projects which involve civil society. So you have this situation where we're unsure where the Chinese are headed, where they will be pushed, and where they can push back, right? At this moment, they're staying with the rhetoric of equality and respect, although the civilization basis of it is still there. And the civilizationism automatically presupposes that when you push your civilization superiority, you're pushing a kind of nationalism. So there is that. And you have reports in Africa, you have very complex mixed result reports from Africa and so on about racism, Laos and so on also. And certainly they are not at all popular in Central Asia, although the governments like them there. So, what I wanted to say here was, however, there is a different dimension that China there's a novel form of power that China controls, which allows it certain flexibility that the earlier imperialists couldn't quite control except through military means. And that is the technological communications and infrastructure. As you must know very well as a European, the Europeans complain that Huawei and the Chinese authorities have something called a kill switch. And even if they don't kill it off, if they don't give you the parts, the correct parts to update your technology, you can lose technology in a very crippling way. Your electricity, phone system, and so on. And recently, I don't know if you followed, in Spain, they've had these problems. And I think maybe I'm exaggerating, but Huawei, which controls the systems in Spain also, apparently they had some parts that were not very good and they were called out by the Spanish government. And soon after, they had that blackout for 18 hours and now have that phone outage. But we can check that. It's just, a thought that may be a new mode of control that they have, especially because a lot of countries in the global south where they are do not know anything much about data sovereignty. So much of these protocols and so on are controlled by China. And the new parts and so updating parts and so on are that. So this is a novel type of, I mean, every century has had novel types of instruments of control, right? Or every whatever, every time period has had. And I think this is a very interesting one, which also, of course, incorporates what is it called? Facial recognition and all of those kinds of things. So, this is the arena, I think. It's the arena of digital power where much will be fought out, which is why also there's so much competition over AI and things today. So, I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but anyway.
Yeah. So I think that basically you were saying before, like we were talking about like China rise, a peaceful rise, civilization discourse, and also hegemonic discourse. And maybe the sort of rising hegemony of China should be measured and should be looked differently through its
Absolutely.
control over technology, for instance.
Yep.
No
Yep.
longer alliances, military expansion, because you can do control, you can control it, and you can really affect economies of other countries. You can put countries into their knees if you have control over critical infrastructures, technology. And also there is a question of dual use, right? There are articles about
Yeah.
so China has all these ports around the world, infrastructures, and they could potentially, in time of war, being used for other purposes. Like now it's just
Absolutely.
civil, but again, nothing excludes in the future. So I think it's
Yeah.
important reminder to we have to basically change a bit our paradigm in the way we look at China expansion and also as a
Yeah.
threat or hegemonic expansion. The
Yeah.
thing though is that sometimes we conflate too much, right? And so there are definitely some benefits. China is
Absolutely.
bringing like this technology 5G to Africa, Huawei. It will not be there. So I think it's also a matter for recipient countries of balancing, right? Cost and
Absolutely.
benefit. And the problem that, as you mentioned before, data sovereignty. China is a big promoter of data sovereignty, right? Even in its guidelines, laws, regulations, and it tries to also promote it abroad. But the problem that these recipient countries do not have the capacity. So it's not the
Exactly.
knowledge, but it's really the capacity, the means,
Capacity.
yeah, to protect their data.
Their data.
It's not
Yeah.
just with China, but it's also with United States.
Google and all the Microsoft and so on. Yeah, I agree with you that there is a lot of benefit from China, especially the sale of these renewables and so on at a very reasonable, well, relatively reasonable rate. But so this is one issue that I think needs to be understood. And of course, every other power also realizes that this digital control is very important. But China has raced ahead of them and can do this, especially in the global south. So, this is perhaps, you know, there were always three modes in which imperialists controlled. One was direct military control, the other is finance or debt, and the third was, what is it, soft power. Now, in a sense, the soft power has become communication power and digital power and has leapt forward in so traditional soft power like Confucius Institutes and so on, they don't do very much. It is this communication infrastructure that is, we would say, weaponized, is dual use. And so that always gives a, and China has been doing that. You know, there is a, I don't know if you know, I'm from Assam, right? And I mean, I'm originally from Assam. On the Assam Tibet border, which is contested by the Chinese, there is a Yarlung Sangpo River which feeds into the Brahmaputra River, which in turn feeds Assam and Bangladesh, almost all of Bangladesh. And they have built a dam just at that point of connection that is many times the size of three gorges. And that dam is located in an area which has many earthquakes. So this could completely devastate some regions, right? Now, why put the dam there? And who needs that electricity? Tibet has many dams, many of which have been destroyed by earthquakes. You know,
Wow.
just in the last 3 months,
Wow.
there was an earthquake that was not destroyed, affected the dams. So, I mean, you know, there's a lot of this dual use kind of thing, which securitizes while at the same time providing benefits, right?
Mhm.
So, there's an element of that. So, I don't think that the positive and the negative can ever be separated from a hegemonic power. This is, I think, something that we can see across the periods of history
Mm.
that they can provide some
Yeah.
positive things And, the imperialists of the 19th century will say, well, you speak such good English because the British were there, right?
That's like great.
Whatever that means.
Yeah. Wow.
So things like that. So we have to understand what are the ways in which it is negative and what are the ways that it is positive and which can prevail.
But do you think there's like other kind of analysis beside cost benefit? Because like this is basically positive, negative is cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, it
I think
is.
there are something that transcend maybe. I hope there are still things in criteria that transcend the cost benefit analysis.
On the
Uh,
part of China.
yeah, China expansion or hegemon.
Yeah,
Think about hegemon.
that's
It's
what
also
that's yeah,
true because we think about hegemon in a
yeah,
negative way, or also authoritarian states, right? We
yeah,
always associate authoritarian hegemon with like bad. This is bad.
yeah,
But as you said, there's always some positive aspects, like even in
yeah,
an authoritarian regime, like to survive, you must provide something, right? To
yeah,
there's some trade-off if you want.
yeah, a
Can we
trade-off.
escape this like very economic terminologies like cost
But
benefits or like
yeah, I think it's the terminology that's the problem.
yeah
I think that the tension is not necessarily an economistic one. The tension is between I believe people like Xi Jinping and so on are genuinely interested and genuinely believe you had a question about that their vision is ethical, that
yeah
their vision is an ethical compared especially to what they think of as Western imperialists. Western imperialists, meanwhile, say we've given liberal governments to everybody and so on, and this, that, and the other. But they believe that this is a far better method. But at the same time, they also believe that they have to secure their interests and expand their role. So it's not a trade off in that sense. It's that historically we cannot separate the one from the other. So the question is, when are the circumstances when the state interests get pushed further and further and beyond the limit of what they themselves found acceptable? And so far, they don't want to militarize directly, but
hmm
they want to use the threat of all these other things, right? So I think that's the way to look at it, and to recognize that each form can sort of extend its own value to the world by developing new forms of power that also control the world.
I want to now move to the environmental sustainability because you mentioned about Xi Jinping having also an ethical vision of the world beyond
Yeah.
like security, cost benefit, interest. And so you argue that the crisis of environmental sustainability must become a new form of transcendence. And I wonder, how do you evaluate China's efforts to universalize its ecological civilization model, both within the Belt and Road Initiative and also through new attached initiatives like the Global Development Initiatives? And also, what can you tell us about these ethical goals? Do you see any continuity with Asian cosmologies, in particular the Chinese one, with this view of ecological civilization or other aspects of this ethics that you see kind of this continuity and legacy from the past? Or it's all constructed, like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. I think that, first let's talk about within China, uh, how does the ecological civilization thing work, right? And I think one of the questions that was embedded was the issue of, is it genuine or is it instrumental? And I think that it is certainly been mobilized instrumentally, although, as I said, Xi Jinping also feels that China is genuinely 5,000 years old and has a lot of these cultural options and possibilities within its repertoire, historical repertoire, right? So they are being mobilized. There's particularly somebody who was very close to him was this gentleman called Pan Yue. You know Pan Yue?
Mhm.
Pan Yue was seemed to be very genuinely. affected by the Chinese traditions of particularly Taoism and things like that. Although many people opposed him, but he was certainly that way. But I think by and large, it is being mobilized because this is a very top down thing, right? The whole eco civilization is a top down thing, as your colleague Li Fei and others have also argued. And as a top down thing, it is unclear how much people within are inspired by these ideals. There are some, there's no question that there are people, there are communities that set up their own self help groups and so on who are actually inspired by Asian traditions and things. There are Buddhist groups as well. But these are, of course, to some extent curtailed by what would they be curtailed by? They're not seen as oppositional, so they wouldn't be curtailed by that. But the difficulty of surviving as a collective and things like that. So there are some, and there is people like the agricultural economist Wan Tiejun and so on, who do build on the rural reconstruction tradition, and he has popularity among a lot of young people, right? And the rural reconstruction themselves built on a lot of ideas of tradition and things. So there are movements like that, but by and large, the state-driven thing is one of of quotas, and quotas also for production and quotas for environment. And there has been sort of a kind of a freeze in the Chinese government. Where they have been very successful is in the production of renewables, as we know. And this is the main, for a long time, although they had ecological civilization, I noticed that they did not introduce ecological civilization into BRI until very late, because they were, of course, not being ecological for the longest time until 2019, 2020 or so. They were being very fossil fuel oriented. They were being very bringing their own labor and this, that, and they still do that. But now the strategy is very much to sell electric vehicles and batteries and renewables and other kinds of things, which of course gives them a huge market. One other thing in this matter of, when not the matter of transcendence and ethic, but so I think that there are people who, I mean, it's good to keep these ideals alive because it does inspire some people, right? But I don't think it has had much effect globally.
Why you think so?
I think, in a way, it is the failure of the traditional form of soft power. I have never believed that a state could develop soft power. When you look at how the US developed soft power, it was not state agencies, it was Hollywood and star systems and all of those kinds of things, right? It was really something that the people felt was not propagandistic. It was much more hegemonic in a Gramscian sense, And the state fostered one, I think, because you always see the interests of the state. You people ultimately can see the interests of the state. This is something that the Chinese, I think, will have a hard time resolving.
Mm. But I think even domestically, because of all the
Probably.
propaganda, who really believes in it? You have to, because in China you
Yeah,
have control, yeah, you make rules
yeah,
and regulations,
yeah,
you have to abide to this
yeah,
ecological civilization. And
yeah.
some people believe in it, but probably not because of the state. So
Exactly.
right? But
Yeah,
I think when you go externally, how effective this would be, and I think the same is for the general propaganda, the media. China has been
yeah,
very hard, invested so much money to buy media, promote its media globally. And what was the result? I mean, it's a very mixed, probably very, very low return for the
very low
amount
return.
of investment.
I agree with that. I
Yeah.
completely agree with
But
that.
you don't think there can be a sort of a China dream in the future, like with all this ethics, like, cherry picking something of the past? Probably that doesn't have to be done by the state, right? Because, as you said, there is all this repertoire, right? Huge, immense
Yeah,
historical
yeah,
repertoire, civilization repertoire. And then the
yeah.
state selects its own narrative, its own facts, genre, right? It's like bringing civilization, Buddhism, and so forth. When,
Yeah,
as you said, just a sailor trying to
yeah,
other
yeah,
stuff, but like how China can become, project soft power. Unless
yeah.
it's just, as you said before, maybe we need to rethink soft power. And so look at
Exactly.
communications
I
of
was
these digital tools. And when you talk about like this digital technology, is the software, is the hardware,
hardware. Exactly.
it, it's the hardware.
No,
It's
it's both. I
both.
mean,
Yeah.
especially if you look at TikTok. You know, TikTok is actually a very fundamental, almost epistemological mechanism of using hard technology for soft power. You know, because TikTok has a lot of things that people are not allowed to see, to post, and things like that, right? They control. I don't know this young people stuff. I've never seen a TikTok. May you might probably know about it. Tell me, how do you think TikTok affects people's attitudes towards Chinese themes?
I think because it's very separated from a Chinese operation versus global operations, and they have to abide recipient countries' regulations. And so I think there are some articles, some investigations that show how things about sensitive topics in China that are kind of pushed down on Taiwan
Sure.
and etc. But I don't think there is the amount of censorship that you have in China on TikTok global.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
China
sure
is
there
very
is.
different. And that's also what is interesting to understand. China within and global China, right? I
Yeah.
think they're intertwined, of course, but they're
Mm,
facing different kind of audience,
exactly.
different environment. And so this gives rise to something that is quite different in some way, right?
Yeah.
What happened within that they try to replicate abroad, but then it's also something quite different, this global China
Yeah.
phenomenon in a way.
But we can also see a possible trajectory. It's not the only possible one of where, as countries become more and more dependent on, especially in global south, on Chinese media and Chinese technology, that there may also be a definite effort to move people in. I don't know, they have still have hundreds of Confucian institutes everywhere. But I think those are principally, I mean, they do monitor. The Confucian institutes do monitor what can be said, what cannot be said, what kind of cultural activities are taking place. And it's all culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's only in the West that Confucian institutes have been removed. The rest of the world, they still have a lot of them.
But even in the West, I mean, we have a data set in the Mapping Global China showing Confucius Institutes, and some still exist in Europe. In Rome, for instance, where I studied, there's
Yeah,
still the
yeah,
Confucius Institutes. And
yeah, yeah.
debates in the States a lot have been kind of
Eliminated.
if not all of them, most of them. But I think there is Maria Rebnikova who has done study on Confucius Institute impact, and it's quite limited, like in
Yeah,
terms of, again, soft power projection. So I
yeah, yeah.
like your idea of like looking something else for soft power. I think there are objective limitations when you have a top-down state
Exactly.
selected soft power, especially in the context of China, right, where it's very much control, a lot of propaganda that doesn't really resonate.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, even places like Stanford and Chicago, when they had Confucius Institutes, they would not permit, speakers on Tibet and this, that, and the other. It was quite top down, and that's what angered a lot of these places. So, yeah, absolutely. I think the issue of how soft power is projected, not through these traditional soft power modes, but through digital control. And you can imagine, even though TikTok is not, has a whole different set of absence of controls in other countries, nonetheless, they have the means. And if there is, it could be weaponized, to put it in your terms.
Yeah.
Or it could be not weaponized. Weaponized is a little too militaristic. It could be oriented towards a Chinese identity.
Yeah, repurposed.
Yeah,
Purpose.
repurposed. Yeah, there you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, this is it's fascinating discussion, right? To rethink soft power, and I think as the time is ticking, and I want to ask you one last question about the future, right? And I'm sure as a historian, you're always a bit
Hesitant.
oh, exactly. We had partly this conversation. So based on what you've seen, the evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative, so China going global, at the beginning, there was no ecological civilization included. Now there is all the civilization discourse, called ecological civilization, and there's a lot of focus on equality and respect of sovereignty. What do you think might come next in the next 10, 20 years? As a characteristics of like China or the narrative, because as you said, these are discourses partly. There is a
Yeah.
reality of like real infrastructures being built, investment, debt, and so forth. But like, what would be another repertoire in a way that would be used as part of this civilization or something else? Like, how it would be filled, this civilization idea that has a hierarchical view of China, some values and so forth. Because like this is very neutral. Yeah, community of shared future, that doesn't really mean much.
I think I'll go back to digital communication control, but I also think, at the same time, this recent India-Pakistan war and so on, what was celebrated most by the non-Indian side was the effectiveness of Chinese jets and missiles, which then had huge stock market price rise. And they were just celebrating this. So militarily, China is getting there. And people are concerned now that unless there is a real alliance in the West, that China can overcome, especially China and Russia. So militarily, I think the possibility always exists. There is technological control, the kill switch, right? And this can be opposed. There is now the one issue is that historically, China, I'm still not coming to the grand statement, but I'm still addressing different problems, different ways of thinking. The issue of debt, right? Now, Laos, for instance, will have to spend the next decade or more if it wants to pay off its debt to China. It may as well be considered a kind of a province of China at some level. And it is so deeply in debt. Pakistan is so deeply in debt. Sri Lanka is so deeply in debt. Bangladesh is so deeply in debt. And they're indebted to all different countries in the world. But the most substantial part are to China. And this actually gives China pause about its projects because unlike in the earlier imperialist periods, it is not easy to just take over an asset.
Yeah.
It is not easy. And China saw this when it got Hambantota for whatever 100-year lease or whatever it got it for. And there was a huge outcry. And of course, more than anything else, it's the national community, the domestic community within these countries that rise up through over the government. Argentina has defaulted now about 10 times.
Yeah.
Nothing has happened to it. I
Yeah.
mean, people have gotten poorer,
Yeah.
but it's not lost its sovereignty. So it's very hard to recover debt. It's just as hard for creditor companies, though it's much harder for the debtor countries, but inflation and things go crazy. So I think China is in some ways developing an old strategy with Chinese characteristics, which
Mm.
is using financial markets. So, in other words, whatever investments it is now putting in, not all, but considerable investments that it is putting in, for instance, railroads and things like that, or ports. It's very big on ports. But the one area in which it remains really negative is extractivism, right? Mineral extraction and things like that. I mean, pay, but it does gives very few rights to the countries, and it's very dirty, environmentally dirty. But I was going on the subject of debt, and the question of debt is that it cannot do it, so it is now financializing its investments. But it's a stock market that is created that is, however, dominated by the government.
Mm.
Dominated in the sense that the government can use it for its various foreign policy purposes, which may not be completely untrue for the US as well, especially with Trump. he keeps trying to use this for that, but he's maybe learning a lesson from these authoritarian
Oh,
countries.
definitely. I mean, I think also what Biden were trying to do with
Trying to do, that's right.
making BRI, but they
Yeah.
also, I feel like also USA, the
Mm.
aid for sure, but there was also a return for the US,
Oh,
using their
absolutely.
own company, exporting their own. So, I
Exactly.
mean, of course, it's
Exactly.
an oversimplification, but how, like, there's always a return.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Absolutely. No
it's
question. Yeah.
important not to be hypocrite, right? Maybe Europe would be probably one that
Yeah.
gave like no, but
Gain the
like,
most. Yeah.
but it is not true. I think like in all cases, there's always a
Right.
strategy, and but I think now the transformation is to provide infrastructures more to the developing world, so things
Yeah.
tangible. Because before
Yeah.
there were all these things that were intangible, and they weren't really creating much soft power
Correct.
leverage in a
Yeah.
way. And maybe now China, by also building things, it creates it uses its own like companies very
Yeah.
often,
Yeah.
and some of its own labor. The debt, like the money goes back to China in some way, although as you said, is also liability. Yeah, I mean the US has done the same. There's nothing wrong. I mean, you
Yeah.
can, like, especially if you want to be on the same level, right?
Yeah.
It's like a win-win situation. We treat you as an equal partner. So
Yeah. Yeah. But the point I was trying to make is that the investments now, which are not just, okay, we'll give you this, you pay it back over how many years. And China does not forgive.
yeah,
China completely always renegotiates the debt, which has been a huge problem for places like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so now it's giving it more. And what is it? Zambia and places like that are, and Ghana also. So it renegotiates. It definitely would create trouble in its own domestic order if people realize that it was just giving away.
all this money, and we're still
Yeah.
developing. I mean, China, I think
But
one.
so it's moving to much more a corporate financial market scheme whereby companies are developed with shares bought by both different Chinese companies as well as, in the case of Pakistan, Pakistani companies and so on. And you know that, I don't know if you know, but China owns 40% of the Pakistani stock market. It controls all the board members and the head of the board. As a result, corruption has come down in Pakistan. The leakage from the stock markets has come down. But
Wow.
at the same time, now all kinds of Chinese institutions can go in and invest and take over the economy. They can essentially make it a province of
But then even
China.
the Greek port of Piraeus, like that
Yeah,
was managed by China, it has never been so successful. So like
yeah. But are the
banks,
Greeks
uh,
benefiting significantly from that?
I don't know
We have to
how,
see.
how
Yeah,
sig- some of there will be spillovers, but always have winners and losers. Probably better than before. But of course, if the Greeks manage their own port effectively and this income will go
yeah.
directly to them, would be probably
To them.
better. But
Yeah,
then if there was in China, there would not even be such a well-managed port of Piraeus in the current context. So
yeah,
again, even 5G in Africa, if there wasn't China, there would not be 5G in some African countries, or there would not
yeah,
be a road. And so
yeah.
was
Absolutely.
kind
Yeah.
of the
So, so,
confusion.
so all I wanted to say about the financialization is that the difference between, say, the US financialization and the Chinese financialization is that the Chinese government has a lot more control over the businesses and the financiers.
Yeah.
Right now, Trump seems to be following that playbook. And you can say that, when Russia started the war and you had these Biden canceled SWIFT payments and things like that, that they were also interfering in the financial market. But that was an extreme case. Here, I mean, it's part of the whole foreign policy, I think, the
Mhm.
role of the Chinese government in financial markets.
And again, I think, as we are saying before, it can always be repurposed. So there are all these
Yeah,
companies abroad,
yeah,
contrary to other countries that, I
yeah,
mean, with harder for them, I think China can potentially regain control and
yeah,
repurpose these companies so that, and there's even regulation that you have to serve the country, China, all member of the same nation, even the diaspora abroad that really brings other questions about the control
Yeah.
of the state
Yeah.
over diaspora and businesses abroad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It can do that too.
I think sometimes the problem, I feel that we sometimes conflate China and sometimes we underestimate China.
Yeah.
And like, we underestimate and then we find ourselves with China that is like leading, I don't know, AI or like
Yeah.
leading
Yeah.
technology at whoa. And then sometimes we conflate and so for no reason. And so it's this kind of
Yeah.
bipolar relation. So like of paranoia
Yeah.
and underestimation.
I mean, China has lots of advantages over other countries, not being at least a controlled non-democracy.
Yeah.
I think it is and is able to plan much more.
Being able to do things long term. But then
Yeah. Well, what I don't understand is internal Chinese politics. I don't know if anybody does, but all these generals and so on being charged out. I mean, the official reason is always some corruption or some bad thing.
I wonder what it is, but it's a interesting time, very different from when I went in 2006 for the first time. You went there much
Oh,
earlier.
yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Duara, for
Well,
being
thank
with us.
you. Yeah.
And we will put some links to your current work if
Yeah.
you have something
Okay, sure,
to
sure.
share. And
Yeah.
thank you so much.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.